Hello, welcome to the channel. Subscribe, leave a like, and don't forget to write a comment. Enjoy watching.
My father turned 75 on a cold March Saturday that felt more like early December than the edge of spring, the kind of bone-scraping cold that tightens your jaw and makes you nostalgic for things that never actually happened. The party was held at the Briar Hill Country Club, nestled between two golf greens still covered in frost, and there were more than 30 people seated at round tables, all leaning in toward the heat of the fireplace and the buzz of long memories. I wore a navy blue dress with sleeves down to my wrists, conservative but fitted enough to remind people that I hadn't let myself go. Not completely, not yet. There was a piano player near the bar, soft jazz trickling into the air like a whisper you couldn't quite catch. The walls were all dark wood and framed black and white photos from decades past. Ivy League alumni, country club galas, hunting trips where nothing bled but egos. My father, William Dempsey, stood near the center of it all, tall as ever but shrunk in presence, like someone clinging to a version of himself from the Nixon era. Still, people clapped when he smiled. He had that politician's grace, warm eyes, square shoulders, and a handshake that convinced people he remembered them even when he didn't. My mother, Eileen, sat to his right in a silk blouse and a neck full of pearls that I suspected hadn't left the drawer since Reagan left office. She hadn't spoken to me in almost 4 months, unless you count the voicemail she left in January. "We won't be needing you for Thanksgiving or anything else." Her tone had the warmth of a nurse informing you your dog didn't make it through surgery. She never used my name anymore. Not even when she was talking about me in the third person, which she did often, especially to Josh, my younger brother by 10 years, and her favorite accessory. I waited until the roasted duck had been cleared and the coffee had been poured, and then I stood, glass in hand, voice clear, mouth dry. "If I may," I said, and all eyes turned, not surprised, exactly, but wary. I'd earned that wariness. The black sheep doesn't get applause, just careful silence. I began the toast slow, deliberate, letting each word settle like ash. To a man who taught me how to fix a leaky faucet before he taught me how to drive. To someone who could spend 40 hours fixing the boat, but not 15 minutes talking about a fight in the house. I let that one sit. My sister, Joanna, shifted uncomfortably. My cousin Frank looked up from his phone. To my father, I continued, who was always the tallest man in the room, and sometimes the quietest. That one got a few nods, even a chuckle. I wasn't here to burn bridges. Not yet. But then I saw her face, my mother, and something in it clicked like a loaded trigger. She didn't like the subtext. She never did. I could feel her foot tapping under the table. She leaned forward, ready to interrupt, but I raised my glass just high enough to force the room's attention back to me. "I want to thank you," I said, eyes still on him, "for being exactly what you were, not perfect, not even close, but human. And for never pretending otherwise, even when it would have been easier to lie." That was when she stood. It was a small sound, the scrape of a chair against the wood floor, but it hit like a cymbal crush. "I think," my mother said, voice cool and sharp as an icicle, "that's enough." She was standing now, not tall, but rigid. The room went quiet. Even the piano player paused. "I have something I need to say," she added, scanning the room like a senator at a press conference, eyes daring someone to stop her. "Lena," she said, finally using my name, "you are officially disowned. You're not family anymore." She said it with the ease of someone reading a parking notice. Like it was overdue. Like it was done and filed. There was no gasping. Just an awful quiet, the kind that comes before a sermon or a slap. I took a sip of wine, swallowed, and looked her in the eye. "That's your right," I said, smiling with all the grace she never taught me. "But it doesn't change anything. Because the truth is older than all of us." I let that hang there, not a threat, not a revelation, just a statement, neutral and ice-cold. My father opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Joanna looked down. Josh stood but didn't speak. And across the room, near the window, someone turned their head just slightly, like they'd been waiting for this moment and were surprised it finally arrived. You ever sit in a room full of people who think they know the rules, only to realize they've been playing someone else's game the whole time? I was done being quiet. Because the truth? The truth had been rotting in our house like bad fruit for decades. And I'd just set the table. The dinner was over. But the reckoning? That had just begun. People say memory is a tricky thing, that it rewrites itself over time, shifting the details just enough to blur the hard edges and soften the blows. But I remember the winter Josh was born as if it were pressed in amber. I was 15 then. No, wait, that can't be right. I must have been 17. He was born when I was 5 years older? No, 10. 10 years. That's right. Josh was born 10 years after me. That's what I've always said, haven't I? I remember sitting on the shag-carpeted stairs of our old house in Fairfield, my knees tucked up to my chin, listening through the railing bars as my mother took call after call, telling relatives that she and my father were finally blessed with a miracle. That word, miracle, floated around our house like a perfumed ghost, always present but never exactly seen, whispered at dinner tables and tossed like confetti at every family event. The miracle in question was, of course, my brother, Josh, golden-haired, dimple-cheeked, perfectly timed to arrive just when my mother needed to be needed again. Back then, I didn't know that families could fracture quietly. I thought explosions were loud, that betrayals made noise, that discontent showed up in shouting matches or slamming doors. But in our house, everything was subtle, and my mother's weapon of choice was silence, wielded with the precision of a surgeon. She never yelled, never raised a hand, she just withheld. Praise, affection, approval, these were things you had to earn, and I never quite made the cut. When Josh came into our lives, it was like I became background noise. He was everything I wasn't, soft where I was blunt, quiet where I questioned, easily pleased and easier to parade. He never asked why the rules changed, never noticed how I started doing my own laundry at 13 or cooking dinner when my mother wasn't feeling up to it. I resented him, of course I did, but not in the way sisters usually resent baby brothers. It wasn't jealousy. It was confusion. He didn't feel like mine. He didn't feel like us. My father, bless him in his flawed way, never stepped in. He was a man raised to believe that if you didn't speak about a problem, it didn't exist. He preferred the garage to the kitchen and fixed things with his hands instead of his words. I can't remember a single moment in my childhood where he took my side over hers. He wasn't cruel, just absent in the ways that mattered most. The day I found the letters, I hadn't been looking for anything. I'd been killing time before a dentist appointment, wandering around the house, bored out of my skull, when I spotted the drawer in his study, the one with the broken lock he never bothered to fix. Inside were tax papers, old receipts, and then, tucked in a file labeled home maintenance, a bundle of envelopes tied together with a rubber band so brittle it cracked as I pulled it off. They weren't love letters, not in the traditional sense, but they had the tone of something intimate, something secret. Each was addressed to my mother, Eileen, but they were signed by someone named Rita. I didn't recognize the name. At first, I assumed it was a friend from college, someone I'd never met, maybe a woman my mother used to lean on before I was born. But the content didn't make sense. One line burned itself into my mind. He looks so much like William, even his toes curve the same. I reread that line at least 5 times, trying to untangle what it meant. Josh would have been 5 at the time, no 10. Sorry, he must have been 10. The math doesn't always sit right in my head, especially when emotions cloud the logic. I stared at that line until it stopped making sense, then flipped to another letter. This one was more direct. I can't keep hiding this, Eileen. It's not right. He deserves to know. My pulse thudded hard in my neck, and for a second, I thought maybe it was some kind of sick joke, an old family drama I'd stumbled into without the full script. But the postmarks were real, the handwriting consistent, and then I found the hospital bill. Dated just 3 days before Josh's birth certificate. The mother's name was Rita Caldwell. The father's section was left blank. At that point, I felt something shift, not in the room, but in my ribs, like a cracked support beam in a house that always looked solid from the outside. I sat there for what felt like an hour, not knowing what to do, not even sure I wanted to know more. But the worst part wasn't the letters or the bill. It was the photo tucked behind them, creased and faded, showing a woman I'd never seen before, holding a baby that looked too familiar, too recent, too much like someone I knew. I didn't confront anyone. Not then. Not for years. I buried what I found like it was a body, told myself I'd misunderstood, misread, miscalculated, anything to keep from tearing apart the already threadbare fabric of our family. But once you see a thing clearly, you can't unsee it. And even silence has a shelf life. The name Rita sat in my brain like a stone. I never heard it again, not until that birthday party, decades later, when I caught a glimpse of a woman in the crowd with eyes too much like mine and a tremble in her hand as she raised her glass. And just like that, I knew the storm wasn't coming. It had already happened. And we were all still pretending it was just a breeze. The first time I saw a photograph of Rita Caldwell, she was wearing a red scarf, wrapped twice around her neck, like she didn't quite trust the air to stay warm on its own. The scarf was thin, almost gauzy, a flash of defiance against the muted tones of the rest of her outfit, a dark wool coat, plain earrings, no lipstick. Her eyes were tired but alert, the kind that had seen too much, but refused to look away, and her mouth was slightly open, like she'd been mid-sentence when someone snapped the picture. It wasn't in any of the letters. It wasn't in the hospital paperwork. I found it later, hidden behind a row of old books on my father's study shelf, stuck between the pages of a gardening catalog from 1976. That catalog had no reason to be there. We never planted anything. We never grew a damn thing. I started asking questions carefully because I knew that in my family, curiosity wasn't rewarded, it was punished. I called the hospital listed on the bill and got nothing but stone-faced answers and a polite woman who informed me that records that old were no longer available without a court order. I didn't have a lawyer or money for one, but I did have a name, and I had time, which, at 24 and newly unemployed, felt like the most dangerous combination of all. I started looking through birth records, combing through local archives, lying through my teeth to get access to things I had no business seeing. Eventually, I found a listing in an old alumni newsletter from Wesleyan University. Rita Caldwell, class of '68, graduated with a degree in literature and a minor in French. No mention of kids. No mention of marriage. I tracked down her yearbook photo, and when I showed it to my father during a visit home, he froze. Not the kind of freeze you see when someone is surprised, but the kind that happens when a buried memory slams back into the room and pins you by the throat. He didn't speak right away, just stared at the photo like it might evaporate if he blinked. Then he put down his coffee, rubbed his temples, and said, "Where did you find that?" His voice was lower than usual, like he didn't want the walls to hear. I told him the truth, that I'd found her name in letters from the drawer, that I'd been wondering about Josh, that I couldn't get past the feeling that something didn't line up. He closed his eyes for a long moment and then did something I didn't expect. He cried. Not loud sobs, not performative grief, but the kind of quiet breakdown you see in movies about men raised during wartime, the kind where the body holds it in for decades until the seams crack and it all comes spilling out in a single breath. He told me that Rita had been the love of his life, that they met before he ever knew my mother, that they had planned a life together, small and simple until things got complicated. He didn't use the word pregnant. He didn't have to. He said Eileen had found out, that she confronted Rita, that somehow, and he never explained exactly how, she ended up raising Josh as her own. There were choices made, he said, staring out the window. Some of them weren't mine. When I asked where Rita went, he only said, she left town. She didn't have a choice either. And then, almost as an afterthought, he added, your mother made sure of that. He begged me not to dig further. Said it would rip the family apart. that people wouldn't understand. That Eileen had threatened to destroy him socially, financially, in every way that mattered. And the truth was, I believed him. Not because he was the hero of the story, he wasn't, but because I had lived under my mother's shadow long enough to know that she didn't bluff. She didn't raise her voice. She just erased you quietly, like chalk from a board, until even your name felt foreign on her tongue. I should have stopped there. I should have let it go, packed the letters away, and gone back to pretending like my family wasn't built on a stolen lie. But I couldn't. Because once you ask a question like, whose son is he really? You can't unask it. You can't pretend it was rhetorical. So one night, after half a bottle of Cabernet and a long stare at the ceiling, I called Josh. I didn't know what I was going to say. I didn't even know if I wanted answers or just noise to drown out the guilt. He picked up on the second ring, like he'd been expecting me. I didn't waste time. I told him what I'd found, the photo, the letters, the birth record. There was silence on the other end. Not shock. Not outrage. Just silence, followed by a breath that told me everything I needed to know. He already knew. Maybe not the full story, but enough. I owe her everything, he said finally. Don't take that from me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to shake him. I wanted to ask how the hell he could stay loyal to someone who'd lied to him since birth. But then I realized he wasn't talking about Eileen. He was talking about Rita. And that changed everything. Because if Josh knew the truth and had known it for years, then the lie wasn't just buried. It was protected. And maybe, just maybe, I wasn't the only one keeping secrets in that house. People like to believe that revenge is spontaneous, that it comes roaring out of the chest like a storm after a long drought, wild and unplanned and born of pure emotion. But the truth is, real revenge, the kind that actually works, takes patience, calculation, and more discipline than most people are willing to stomach. I spent 6 months planning that birthday party, every guest, every flower arrangement, every piece of catered hors d'oeuvres placed with the precision of a war map. My mother thought she was hosting it, of course. She believed she was the one pulling the strings, as always, directing everything from the wine list to the seating chart with that brittle elegance she'd honed over decades. But the joke, the real bitter punchline, was that she didn't even realize the invitations had come from my address, under my name. All she knew was that things were finally being done right, which to her meant no unexpected speeches, no open bars, and definitely no drama, which is exactly why I gave her all 3. The guest list was mine from the start, though I let her believe otherwise. I reached out to every cousin, every college friend of my father's, every old neighbor she barely tolerated but had to pretend to like. I sent emails and made phone calls and even handwrote a few notes to give it all that extra personal touch. And somewhere, in between the RSVPs and the catering tastings, I made one invitation that would change the course of everything. I sent a message to Claire. Claire Caldwell. The daughter of the woman whose name still lingered like smoke in my father's study, the daughter of Rita. Finding her wasn't as hard as I thought it'd be. Lawyers, especially successful ones, tend to leave a digital trail, and Claire had been featured in a few local articles for her work on probate litigation. How poetic, I thought, that she specialized in unwinding tangled family estates. I didn't say much in the message, just that we needed to meet, that I had something important to discuss, and that it involved both our mothers. She responded within 24 hours, her reply short and clinical, time and place. We met in a coffee shop that smelled more like printer ink than coffee beans, the kind of place where young professionals held awkward interviews and older men pretended to write novels. Claire was poised, not flashy, her hair pulled into a clean bun, her voice low and deliberate. She didn't smile when I spoke. She didn't flinch when I told her who I was or how I knew about her mother. When I laid the letters on the table, copies, of course, she read them like a surgeon studies a scan, searching for weak points. And then she nodded once and said, "Tell me what you need." All I asked was that she come to the party. She didn't need to speak, didn't need to reveal who she was. Just be there. Observe. Wait. She agreed, without a trace of hesitation. That was when I knew she wasn't just her mother's daughter. She was her own kind of weapon. The morning of the party, I woke up early and dressed with more care than I had in years. It wasn't about looking good, it was about looking right. I wanted to wear something my mother wouldn't approve of but couldn't criticize out loud, something elegant enough to earn a second glance, but not a compliment. The dress was dark blue, form-fitting, simple, with sleeves that grazed my wrists like a dare. By the time I raised my glass for the toast, everything was in place. Claire stood near the back wall, quiet, anonymous, a shadow with perfect posture. My father looked proud, unaware. Josh looked wary, as if part of him already suspected I had stopped playing by the rules. And my mother, Eileen, sat with her hands folded over her lap, smiling that tight little smile that never quite reached her eyes. She thought she had survived the storm. She thought she had buried the past so deep no one would dare dig it up. My toast started like any other. I thanked the guests, made a few gentle jokes, sprinkled in just enough sentiment to draw out a soft sigh or two. But then, I shifted the tone, slow and subtle, like a pianist easing into a darker key. I'd also like to raise a glass, I said, to a woman of grace and silence, whose presence shaped this family in ways we've never acknowledged, but always felt. There was a pause then, long enough for every head to turn slightly, long enough for Eileen's smile to falter, just a hair. To the ones who never got a seat at this table, but without whom none of us would be sitting here. That was when it happened. Eileen stood so suddenly her chair scraped back with a sharp cry. Her face was pale, eyes wide, voice clipped and trembling. "You are officially disowned," she said, loud enough for every head to swivel, every fork to pause midair. "You're not family anymore." She didn't even realize she'd walked into it. She thought she was defending herself. But what she'd really done was confess. Later, Claire approached her outside the venue. It wasn't public, I made sure of that, but it was immediate. A brown envelope. Legal seal. Motion for probate review. Request for estate freezing. Claire handed it over like she was giving back something that had been stolen. That night, my mother called me 6 times. I didn't answer a single one. The next morning, Claire and I had breakfast in silence. She looked over her coffee and said, "You still haven't told them the worst part." And I smiled, not the way my mother smiles, not tight-lipped and hollow, but real, and said, "I will." She raised an eyebrow, waiting. "At the funeral," I said. "Because some things deserve an audience. And some truths only matter once the room can no longer deny them." The call came on a rainy Thursday, the kind of rain that doesn't pour or crash or flood, but lingers like a ghost in the air, soaking everything with a damp cold that slides under your skin and makes you feel like you're decomposing from the inside out. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, almost disturbingly detached, a nurse, or maybe an administrator, someone reading a script about loss with the rhythm of someone confirming a canceled appointment. My father had died in his sleep. No pain, no warning, just a stroke, quick and final. A peaceful passing, they said. I wondered if it felt peaceful to him. I wondered if he had time to think about the woman he loved but abandoned, the daughter he kept at a distance, or the son he raised under someone else's name. The funeral was small, the kind of small that comes not from a lack of people but from an overabundance of lies. Nobody knew where to stand. Nobody knew what to say. My mother wore a black dress she'd probably picked out a decade ago, just in case. She didn't cry, of course. Eileen Dempsey didn't do grief in public. She did silence, posture, long blinks that dared people to interpret them as emotion. Josh stood beside her, expression unreadable, hands clenched behind his back like he was afraid of touching anything too real. I stayed off to the side, not quite hidden but not in focus either. No one asked me to speak. I hadn't expected them to. When the priest asked if anyone had final words, I shook my head. That moment didn't belong to me. It belonged to the illusion. The man in the casket wasn't the father I knew. He was the version of my father that everyone else had decided to remember, noble, stoic, dedicated. The man I remembered hid in tool sheds and behind newspaper pages, in silence and compromise, and in 1,000 moments where he could have told the truth, but didn't. He wasn't evil. He wasn't abusive. He was just afraid. And fear, when fed for long enough, becomes cowardice. We went to the wake at the country club, same place where it all started, same fireplace glowing low in the background, same jazz humming just loud enough to pretend we weren't all thinking about the same things. People brought casseroles and awkward hugs, memories too polished to be real, and I let it wash over me like static. I drank water instead of wine. Not because I needed to stay sharp, I already was, but because I didn't want to blur the moment I'd been building toward for years. When the room settled into that quiet murmur that comes after dessert but before departure, I stood. No one asked me to. No one stopped me either. The conversations died like candles in a windstorm. I looked at every face in that room, faces I'd known my entire life, faces that never looked back when things got ugly, and I said what no one else had the courage to speak aloud. You all loved a man who built his life on unfinished stories. That doesn't make him a villain. But it doesn't make him a hero either. My mother's fork clinked against her plate, sharp and hollow. He loved someone before her. A woman named Rita. Some of you might remember the name. Most of you probably don't. That's how it works with women like her. They get erased. I could see the twitch in Eileen's jaw, that tiny flicker of control slipping. But here's the truth, plain and cruel. Rita gave birth to Josh. My mother raised him. Not out of love. Out of ownership. Out of victory. And then Rita disappeared. You could hear a pin drop or maybe a soul cracking. I found the coroner's report last year, I continued, voice steady, hands calm. Rita died the same week Josh was adopted. Official cause, suicide. Unofficially? I think she was broken. I think she was cornered. Josh stood then, his face pale and drained. That's not fair, he said, but his voice wavered. He didn't deny it. That's what stuck with me. I turned toward him, not harshly, but with the kind of clarity that slices through denial like a blade through silk. You don't owe her your silence, I said. You owe yourself the truth. Then I looked at my mother, and her face, God, her face, was more hollow than I'd ever seen it. Not angry, not defiant, just empty. Like she'd finally run out of performances. I was disowned, I said, to no one in particular, because I refused to pretend. Because I wouldn't let silence bury someone who didn't deserve it. Because I pulled the thread she spent her life tying knots around. There were no interruptions. Not a gasp. Not a cry. Just that awful stillness that comes when the lie breaks apart and no one knows what to do with the truth. I never filed the case, I said then, quieter now. The one about the will. I never wanted the money. I wanted her to know that the past doesn't go away just because you lie better than everyone else. And then I let the silence linger, let it stretch long and awkward, let it crawl over their shoulders like guilt. But Claire did file, I added. Not on my behalf. On her mother's. And then I stepped down, walked out, and didn't look back. The air outside was cold and sharp, like the sky had finally exhaled after years of holding its breath. People will tell themselves all kinds of stories to avoid seeing what's in front of them. They'll rewrite history, reframe guilt, recast villains as saints and martyrs as mad women. But there's a moment, a single, quiet, clean moment, when the truth steps out into the light, and no amount of tradition or manners can shove it back into the dark. My mother never spoke to me again after that day. Josh did, eventually. But that's another story. Being disowned doesn't change anything, because I never belonged to you in the first place.